Welcome students in the class of Watershed Management of MMSC Geography 2nd. I, Dr. Dhaneshwar Narayan Pawar, Assistant Professor in Geography, working at MEP Samajas KSKW Arts, Science and Commerce College, Shudko, Nasik. Once again, welcome you all in the lecture Characteristics of Watershed. Friends, in the previous lecture we had discussed about the delineation of watershed. Delineation of watershed on the basis of manual digitization as well as delineation of watershed basis of automatic delineation of watershed. Now today we will discuss about the second point of this unit second, which includes major characteristics of watershed. There are several characteristics of watershed, but as per syllabi, we have given some selected characteristics of watershed. At the end of this lecture, you will be understood about the size, shape, physiography, climate, drainage, land use pattern, vegetation, geology and soils, hydrology, as well as socio-economic characteristics of watershed, how the characteristic of watershed vary according to different aspect, that we will also discuss one by one. Let us see the first characteristics. Before starting the characteristics of watershed, you can see this is the watershed. We had already discussed about the parts of watershed. Here this is the head channel of watershed. This is watershed boundary, which consider the outlet point. The outlet point or watershed discharge comes through the major trunk stream or major river channel, which also joined by several sub streams as well as finger stream. This is considered as a stream network. And finally, all this watershed boundary, which is the area of collecting of water for this watershed. These are nothing but the watershed element. Why we have again discussed about this? Because when we will use the word of these elements in the characteristics of watershed, that you will be understood very easily. Here several characteristics of watershed is given: the size, the shape, the geology, the physiography, the soils, the drainage, the climate, hydrology, a land use pattern, vegetation and socio-economic characteristics of watershed. These are the major characteristics of watershed, any watershed. Here, let us discuss about the first characteristic, that is size of watershed. Friends, the size of watershed is depend upon where is the outlet of watershed. If we consider outlet on the basis of drainage order, once we consider the first order stream, so area will be less. If we consider second order, third order, accordingly, if the number of river order is maximum, and if we consider outlet of this maximum order number stream, ultimately area will be high. For example, Godavari river, Amazon river, Nile river having a very big number of water river order. But when we consider a first order stream, that is finger trip, if we consider that area, it will be the less in the size. Size is very significant effect or significant factor which affect on different functions of watershed. For example, the size of watershed determine the runoff. If the watershed is very small, the runoff will be less. If watershed size will be big, the runoff will be also big. Because once we consider the storage capacity of characteristics of watershed, increasing the size, watershed increases the storage capacity. For example, the run-up or storage capacity of water of Amazon, Ganga, Godavari, Brahmaputra, Nile, Sindhu river is very high. But when we consider a small river channel of any village or in the high elevation periphery, its storage capacity will be less. Another point, the overland flow in the size of watershed is vary according to its area. If the watershed will be smaller in terms of its size or geographical area, the overland flow will be very high or peak. Then if watershed is medium, the size will be not maximum or not very less. That time the dominating overland flow we can observe in such type of watershed. Another part is if watershed is large or its area is maximum, so there will be no significant overland flow. So small size considers small, medium and large watershed and overland flow will be vary. Another part is the size of water increases, the stream number and order increases. Means if the watershed size is maximum, the stream number and stream order will be also maximum. For example, 7th order streams watershed is there. So the total number of streams will be vary, as well as it again contribute more runoff, more water volume to the main outlet of this watershed. Effect of volume of water which is caused by the rainfall. Watershed area required the estimation of several basin parameter, and the first parameter required for that is the size or geographical area of watershed. Friends, after the size of watershed, the second characteristics of watershed is shape. Now what is difference between size and shape? Size shows the geographical area in square meter, square kilometer or in square mile or in square feet, and shape is the aerial view of watershed that includes its longest part, its rectangular part on the basis of its boundary and size. Because when we classified the major characteristics of watershed into aerial, linear and relief characteristics, the shape is aerial characteristics. If we consider aerial view of any watershed, it will give you the idea about shape of watershed, longest watershed, circular watershed, etc. And there are several methods, several formulas. On the basis of this, we can identify the shape of watershed. Therefore, shape is aerial characteristics of watershed. Watershed has several variety of shapes, and it will give you the idea about potential efficiency of any drainage network of that watershed. Nowadays, there are three major methods which available to find out shape of watershed. First one is form factor, another one is circularity ratio and elongation ratio. On the basis of this, the shape of watershed can be identified. If the shape of watershed is circular, it means that the runoff will be reached same time at the outlet. So maximum runoff, maximum discharge will be there, because shape affect on the runoff, especially when it collected at the outlet. For the circularity shape, the runoff will be same at the reach point. If the elongated software is there, elongated shape of watershed is there, it will be reached, it will take maximum time. So accordingly, the shape also affect on runoff factor. Now third characteristics of watershed is geology. Its most significant factor which affect the watershed development. If we consider the development of any topography or development of watershed, watershed has three types or three stages: youthful stage of watershed, mature stage and old stage. In the youthful stage, we can say the relief will be high. In the mature state, it will be less, and in the old state, it will be very flat. So, geology affect on all these stages of development of waters. Geology also influence on the size and shape of watershed characteristics. For example, shape will be determined the geology, which type of rock is there, which type of stream were formed, what type of drainage network is there, which type of drainage network is there. On the basis of this, size will also determined. So all these factors will determine or influenced by the geology of watershed. Again, geology reflect in the soil types, soil texture and soil productivity. As well as geology also affect on soil erosion and surface runoff of the watershed. Geology affect on drainage density of the watershed, drainage density affect on the discharge of watershed. Geologically directly and indirectly also control the land use land cover of watershed. It also define, affect the surface runoff and soil loss pattern. Geology affect on the aquifer and groundwater condition or groundwater basin of that watershed, as well as it is affect on the mechanical measures of watershed management. So everywhere geological factor directly and indirectly affect on several watershed characteristics. For example, if we consider the soil erosion, if we have to find out the erosion, how much erosion occur in the watershed, that time one major component required for that the estimation of erosion of that watershed is geological factor, because geology affect on the erosion, it affect on the permeability, it affect on the soil structure, soil texture. All factors is directly and indirectly affect due to geology. This is the major characteristics of watershed. Now here you can see there are several types of drainage pattern, and this drainage pattern control or decide by the geology of that particular area. Here you can see this is dendritic pattern of drainage, and this dendritic pattern is result of uniform bedrock. So entire geology will be uniform, equal. Here this is rectangle pattern of drainage, and this rectangle pattern of the drainage is result of joint or jointed bedrock. So the cracks will be there, joints will be there, and therefore the drainage pattern will be different. It also determines the size again. This is the radial pattern. This radial pattern is controlled by this volcanic domes and hillsides area. Now in this picture you can see the trellis pattern of drainage, and this is decided due to the bedrock or resistance bedrock. This resistance bedrock, it result or form the trellis pattern. In short, geology also affect on drainage pattern and the channel development of any watershed. With the help of these four pictures which is taken from this side, you can see how geology affect on drainage pattern, and drainage pattern again affect the size and shape of watershed. Next point is the physiography. Physiography of watershed includes the influence of area, length, width, shape, slope, aspect and flow direction. If the physiography consider, the watershed can be defined into different types. For example, when the youthful topography will be there, it is known as hilly watershed, then mountainous watershed or plain surface watershed. For example, if watershed will be in the Himalayan region, it is called as hilly watershed. If watershed on the Deccan Plateau, it is called as mountainous watershed. And if watershed is in plain surface area like Ganga plain region, it will be plain surface watershed. Physiography also determine the recharge zone, transition zone and discharge zone of any watershed. Always recharge zone will be in upper side where the origin of river will be there, origin of fingertip will be there. It is known as recharge zone. Transition zone is zone between the discharge zone and recharge zone, and finally discharge zone we can notice in the plain surface, plain area of watershed near to the mouth of watershed. Physiography also influence on the soil properties, physical and chemical. If hilly physiography is there, slope is very steep, that time soil characteristics is valid. For example, physical characteristics of soil is coarser soil texture will be there. There will be absence of carbon and organic matter in the hilly region. But if flat surface or plain surface area will be there, it will show the presence of carbon as well as organic matter characteristics. It will show the microporosity is maximum rather than the macroporosity. It will show the silty and clay loamy sand or textural properties of soil. So physiography influence on the soil properties of watershed. Physiography also affect the hydrological properties of watershed. For example, infiltration capacity and hydraulic conductivity. Infiltration means the percolation of water in the straight way, and hydraulic conductivity means the spreading rate of water in the soil. Both these characteristics will be affected due to the physiography. In the hilly region or in the top of the hills, the infiltration capacity will be less. If the infiltration capacity will be less, it will result into high runoff or severe runoff. In the middle of the watershed or in the plateau region, infiltration capacity will be increased, it will reduce the runoff, and in the plain region, again infiltration capacity will be high, it will decrease the surface runoff. In short, physiography also affect the hydrological properties of watershed. Another part is physiography influence on the watershed management and erosion measures of or structure of the watershed management. If suppose mechanical as well as drainage line treatment is there, it will be decided by the physiography. If the hilly region is there, that time in the fingertip stream order, the mechanical measure will be reducing the surface runoff as well as reducing the soil loss through a stone at the fingertip. Once we go through the hilly region to the plain surface area, that time burns of soil will be useful. In short, physiography consider or physiography affect on the mechanical measures, drainage line treatment of the watershed. And finally, the main effect of physiography is on the land use and land cover pattern of watershed. Land use is use of land by the man. For example, built up land use for the farms, land use that is agricultural land. If land use for the construction or hills or the houses, it is built up land. Land use for the roads, it is also built up land. If the land use for the plantation, it is again forest land. So on the basis of this use of land by man, we can categorize the land use classes. as well as land cover. Land cover is natural phenomena. For example, if rocky surface is there, this is known as rocky land. If the vegetation, high vegetation, natural vegetation is there, it is known as forest cover, etc. is land cover. So land use, land cover also affected by the physiography. In the hilly region, barren land will be maximum, fallow land will be maximum. In plain surface area, the agricultural land will be dominant. So physiography also affect on the land use, land cover of watershed, and land use, land cover of watershed affect on the surface runoff, soil erosion. So this is the complexity or complex relationship of physiography and another part of the characteristics of the watershed. For example, hilly watershed suitable for forestry or agroforestry. Plain watershed will be suitable for agriculture, cropping and settlement. Slope is one part of the physiography which determines the infiltration rate as well as runoff as well as soil and soil productivity. If the slope is gentle, the soil productivity high. If the slope is very steep, the soil productivity will be maximum. If slope is steep, soil loss and surface runoff will be severe. If slope is gentle, runoff and soil loss will be less. If slope is gentle, infiltration rate will be maximum. If slope will be the steep, infiltration rate will be less. So this is the effect of slope on this infiltration rate, surface runoff, soil loss and soil productivity. Now we'll stop here. In the next video lecture we will see remaining characteristics of